All right, so it's the one that says 4.4 part 2, but it's actually 4.6 part 2. We're going to talk about complex conjugates. So complex conjugates are pairs of complex numbers. So we talked about this in 4.5, where if we had something like 2 plus square root 5 as one of our zeros, we know that its conjugate is also going to be a 0. So the conjugate of that would be 2 minus square root 5. So the first number stays the same. The only thing that changes is the sign in the middle. Now we're also going to be doing the same thing, but with imaginary numbers too. So if I had 4 plus 3i, what's the conjugate of that? 4 minus 3i. Or if I had something like negative 6i, what's the conjugate of that? Positive 6i. So if we have square roots or imaginary numbers, they happen in conjugate pairs. So you're not just going to have one of them, you'll have its conjugate pair too. All right, let's look at example 3. So we want to write a polynomial function of least degree that has rational coefficients, a leading coefficient of 1, and the zeros 2 and 3 plus I. So we have an I, so we know that we need its complex conjugate. What would the conjugate of that be? So it's 3 plus I. So what's the conjugate of that? 3 minus I. Now we have to come up with the polynomial. So we're going to write this in factored form and then multiply it out. So it's always x minus whatever number. So x minus 2. X minus 3. Now we change both of the signs, so minus I. And then the other one would be x minus 3 plus I. So you always change the signs when you put it in factored form. Yes. So from here, we're going to FOIL it out. We always want to start with our conjugate pair first, because we have a conjugate shortcut for that. So our shortcut is a squared minus b squared. Now, what's exactly the same in both of these? What do you think our a is going to be? X minus 3. They're exactly the same in both of them. What's different is the sign. So that separates our a and b, is the sign. So x minus 3 is our a, so we're going to say x minus 3 squared. And then what do you think our b is? I. So minus I squared. So x minus 3 squared, we have to FOIL out. We're going to write it twice and FOIL it out. X minus 3 times x minus 3. So here we get x squared minus 3x minus 3x plus 9. We can combine that, our like terms, but I'm going to save that step for the end. What is I squared? Anybody remember what I squared changes? 1. It is negative 1. So if you have an I squared, it changes to negative 1. But we have minus negative 1, so what would that turn into? 1. A plus 1. Now I'm going to combine my like terms. So I have x squared minus 6x plus 10. So all we did so far was FOIL the second two together. So we're going to be dealing with imaginary numbers a lot. Anytime that you have an I squared, you want to change it to be negative 1. So make sure you remember this rule. So in this section, we're going to see that a lot. The I is always going to cancel out when you FOIL your two conjugates together. You're not going to have an I in your answer. So it's always going to go away because it'll change to be negative 1. All right, so we only FOILed the second two together. We did our conjugate shortcut. We multiplied those two. Now we still have to multiply the first one to it too. So we're going to multiply x minus 2. So make sure everything in the first set gets multiplied to everything in the second. So starting with x times x squared would be what? X cubed. X times negative 6x. Negative 6x squared, and x times 10 is 10x. Then moving on to negative 2 times x squared would be negative 2x squared. Negative 2 times negative 6x would be plus 12x. And negative 2 times 10 would be negative 20. And then our last step, we just combine the like terms. So x cubed, negative 6x squared minus 2x squared would be negative 8x squared. We have 10x plus 12x would be 22x minus 20. So this would be our answer. All right, so we have the zeros of negative 1 and 4i. Are we missing any? What is the conjugate of 4i? Negative 4i. So let's put them into factored form. So it's always x minus. We always just flip the signs. So what would our first one be? If we put negative 1 in factored form, what would it turn into? X plus 1. And then we have x minus 4i and x plus 4i. Now let's FOIL our conjugates together first. Remember, you can FOIL or use your conjugate shortcut. I'm going to do the conjugate shortcut just to show you guys, but you can FOIL it out. If you do it right, you'll get the same answer. So our conjugate shortcut is a squared minus b squared. So our a would be our x here, because what separates the a and b are the different signs. So a would be x and b would be 4i. So we have x squared minus 4i squared. So x squared here, we have to distribute the squared to the 4 and the I. So this would turn into minus 16i squared. Well, what did we say I squared changes to? Negative 1. So we're going to change this to be negative 1. Well, what's negative 16 times negative 1? Positive 16. So we have x squared plus 16. Any questions so far?
How do you get plus again? Oh, the negative 1.
Yeah, negative 1 times negative 16. Now we're going to multiply x plus 1 to it. So we FOIL these two together. So x times x squared would be x cubed. X times 16 is 16x. 1 times x squared is x squared. And 1 times 16 is 16. Make sure you put it in standard form. So we start with x cubed plus x squared plus 16x plus 16. So this would be our answer. All right, let's do the next one. Are we missing any of the zeros that's given? Do we know any other ones? So if 1 plus I square root 5 is one of them, what would the other one be?
Negative 1.
So the 1 stays the same, but the sign in the middle changes. So it'd be 1 minus I square root 5. All right, so what's going to go into factored form here? x minus 3 perfect, and then x minus 1 minus I square root 5, and then x minus 1 plus I square root 5. So let's focus on the conjugates first. We're going to do our conjugate shortcut, so a squared minus b squared. What's our a? X minus 1 would be our a, because that's exactly the same in both of them. What splits up your a and b are the different signs. And then our b would be I square root 5. So we have x minus 1 squared minus I square root 5 squared. X minus 1 squared, we have to FOIL it out. So it's like saying x minus 1 times x minus 1. We get x squared minus x plus 1. Now for I square root 5 squared, we distribute the squared to the I and the square root 5. So this turns into I squared and square root 5 squared. Well, what is I squared? Negative 1. So this would be minus negative 1. What's square root 5 squared?
5.
Just 5. The square root and the squared cancel. So it'd be minus negative 1 times 5. So what would this turn into? Positive 5, so plus 5. Last step, let's combine our like terms. So we have x squared minus 2x plus 6. What do we do next? Multiply the x minus 3 to it. So just make sure everything in the first set gets multiplied to everything in the second. So x times x squared, x cubed, x times negative 2x, negative 2x squared, x times 6, 6x, then negative 3 times x squared, negative 3x squared, negative 3 times negative 2x, 6x, and negative 3 times 6, negative 18. Last step is we want to combine our like terms. So we start with x cubed, then negative 2x squared minus 3x squared would be minus 5x squared, 6x plus 6x, 12x, and then minus 18. So that would be our answer. So 7, we have square root 2 and 1 minus 3i. So are we missing any of our zeros here? What? 1 plus 3i. Anything else? Negative square root 2. So if it's a square root, it needs its conjugate partner. And if it's imaginary, it needs its conjugate partner. So we had to include both missing zeros here. We had 2 missing zeros. So when we put this in factored form, remember it's always x minus. So x minus square root 2. I'm going to write this one over here just to keep them together. So this one would be x plus square root 2. Everybody sees what I did there? Yes or no? I just wrote this one with its pair because I'm going to multiply these two together. So then next we have x minus 1 plus 3i and x minus 1 minus 3i. Remember, you always change the signs, and if you have 2 numbers here, 2 terms, change the signs of both of them. All right, so let's multiply our conjugate pairs now. So I'm going to start by multiplying the first two together. So with these, you could either FOIL or you could use your conjugate shortcut. So I'm going to use the conjugate shortcut just so we can practice. It's a squared minus b squared. What's our a? X. So we have x squared minus, what's our b? Square root 2 squared. So x squared minus, what's square root 2 squared? 2. The square root and the squared cancel, so this would just be x squared minus 2. So we FOILed these two together, or multiplied them together. We did our shortcut. Let's do the other two. So again, I'm going to use my conjugate shortcut, a squared minus b squared. What's our a here? What's our a here? X minus 1. And what's our b? 3i. So we have x minus 1 squared minus 3i squared. So x minus 1, we have to FOIL it out. It's like saying x minus 1 times x minus 1. So when we FOIL this, we get x squared minus x plus 1. What do we do for the 3i squared? Distribute the squared. So what's 3 squared? 9. So minus 9 and then I squared. Well, what does I squared turn into? Awesome. It changes to -1, so that would make it a plus 9. The I goes away. So plus 9. All right, let's combine our like terms. So we have x squared minus 2x plus 10. What do you think our last step is? If I multiplied these two together and then multiplied these two together, what do I have to do next? Multiply the two answers together now. So I'm going to drop this one down here. So I have x squared minus 2. It's getting multiplied to x squared minus 2x plus 10. Yes.
The reason why you're not grabbing you, that's basically that one from the top.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So you always want to multiply your conjugates together to get rid of the square root and to get rid of the I. So we multiplied the first two together, and then we multiplied these two together. So then we have to take those two answers and multiply those two together.
Like normally there was only 3.
Right.
There was 3.
Yeah. So because when we had 3, we only had like one person out here. So multiplied these two together and then drop that one down. So we have 4 here. So let's multiply these two together. What's x squared times x squared? X to the 4th. Then x squared times negative 2x. It's negative 2x cubed. X squared times 10 would be plus 10x squared. Then negative 2 times x squared is negative 2x squared. Negative 2 times negative 2x plus 4x. And negative 2 times 10, negative 20. Last step, combine our like terms. So x to the 4th power minus 2x cubed. This would be plus 8x squared. Plus 4x minus 20.